The warm glow of the television screen illuminated Elijah's living room as he sat focused on a documentary about disability rights. His fingers moved unconsciously, signing along with the speakers on screen as they shared their experiences. The documentary featured activists from across the country, each one fighting for better accessibility and understanding. Elijah's face brightened as he watched successful protests and policy changes unfold before him. Here were people like him, deaf, disabled, different, making real change in the world. His apartment was modest but comfortable, adapted to his needs with visual alerts instead of sound-based ones and specialized equipment to help him navigate daily tasks. Photos lined the walls. Elijah with his sister Maya at her college graduation, family gatherings, and moments from disability awareness events where he'd participated. A framed certificate from his own graduation hung prominently near his desk, a reminder of his persistence despite the challenges he'd faced in higher education. As the documentary ended, Elijah felt energized. He adjusted his hearing aid and grabbed his phone, making sure it was fully charged, a habit Maya had instilled in him for safety. The evening air called to him through his window, and he decided a walk would help process the inspiration he felt from the documentary. He'd always loved his neighborhood at this hour, when the sun was just starting to set and the streets took on a peaceful quality. Outside, he began his usual route, his movements measured but determined. The familiar faces of his neighbors brought comfort. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner house waved as she watered her garden, and he responded with a friendly gesture. The Thompson kids playing basketball in their driveway paused their game to give him their usual greeting, which he'd taught them in sign language months ago. Elijah took pride in these small connections he'd built within his community. Over the years, he'd helped many neighbors understand that his cerebral palsy and deafness didn't define him. They were just parts of who he was, like his love for documentaries or his talent for photography. He walked past the local community center, where he sometimes volunteered, teaching basic sign language to interested residents. The evening seemed perfect until Elijah noticed a police car slowly cruising down the street. He didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols weren't unusual in the area. But then he saw another car join the first, and both vehicles began to slow down. Through his hearing aid, he caught fragments of a dispatcher's voice mentioning a suspicious person report. His heart rate quickened slightly, but he reminded himself that he had every right to be there. He was in his own neighborhood, just a few blocks from home. Several of the younger residents were still out playing, their laughter carrying across the evening air. Elijah continued walking, trying to project the calm he no longer felt. The police cars drew closer, and he could see the officers inside speaking into their radios. The scene shifted abruptly as 3 officers emerged from their vehicles, approaching him with hands hovering near their weapons. Elijah recognized the look in their eyes. He'd seen it before, the mixture of suspicion and prejudgment that came before they even spoke a word. He started to raise his hands, both to show he meant no harm and to begin signing, but the officers' postures only grew more tense at his movement. The officer's approach was aggressive from the start. Officer Jenkins, a veteran of 15 years on the force, took the lead with his hand firmly gripped on his holster. The streetlights cast harsh shadows across their faces as they surrounded Elijah, whose attempts to communicate grew more frantic with each passing second. "Stop moving!" Jenkins barked, misinterpreting Elijah's sign language as threatening gestures. Elijah couldn't fully hear the command through his hearing aid, and his cerebral palsy made his movements appear jerky and uncontrolled to the untrained eye. He tried to reach for his phone to show his medical ID, but this motion only escalated the situation. "Hands where we can see them," another officer shouted, moving closer. Elijah's heart raced as he tried to stay calm, but his body betrayed him. His muscles tensed involuntarily, making his movements seem more erratic. He attempted to point to his hearing aid, to make them understand he was deaf, but the officers saw only defiance in his gestures. Officer Jenkins grabbed Elijah's arm roughly, triggering a spasm that the police interpreted as resistance. Within seconds, all 3 officers were on him. The cold pavement pressed against his face as they forced him down, their combined weight making it difficult to breathe. Elijah's hearing aid was knocked loose in the struggle, plunging him into a terrifying silence. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Rodriguez screamed from her yard, trying to explain to the officers that they were making a horrible mistake. The Thompson kids stood frozen, their basketball forgotten on the driveway, as they watched their friend being handcuffed, face down on the concrete. Through the chaos, one of the officers located Elijah's phone, which had fallen during the struggle. The screen lit up with an incoming call. Maya's face appeared on the display. She was calling for their usual evening check-in, unaware that her brother was being pinned to the ground by 3 armed officers who had never received proper training in dealing with disabled individuals. The look in Elijah's eyes told a story of fear, confusion, and helplessness. His world had shrunk to the feeling of rough pavement against his cheek and the weight of knees on his back. Without his hearing aid, he couldn't even process what was being shouted around him. His only clear thought was of Maya. She would know something was wrong when he didn't answer her call. When Maya's phone rang minutes later, it wasn't her brother's voice on the other end, but a neighbor's panicked explanation of what had transpired. She was at work, 20 minutes away, when she received the call that would change both their lives forever. The neighbor's voice shook as she described the scene, trying to explain how a peaceful evening walk had turned into a brutal display of systemic failure. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare as Maya rushed through the emergency room doors. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she followed a nurse to where Elijah lay, surrounded by beeping machines and concerned medical staff. The sight of her brother's injuries hit her like a physical blow. His face was swollen, bruises darkening across his cheekbone, and his wrists bore angry red marks from the handcuffs. A doctor explained Elijah's condition in clinical terms: contusions, a mild concussion, sprained wrist, and aggravated muscle spasms from the forceful restraint. But what the medical chart couldn't capture was the psychological trauma evident in Elijah's eyes. He kept signing the same phrase over and over: "I didn't do anything wrong." Maya held his hand, careful to avoid the IV lines, fighting back her own tears as rage built inside her. Outside Elijah's room, the incident was already gaining traction. Someone had recorded the arrest on their phone, and the footage was spreading across social media like wildfire. The shaky video showed the clear disparity between Elijah's attempts to communicate and the officer's aggressive response. Local news vans began gathering outside the hospital, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky like metal fingers. Maya's phone buzzed constantly with messages from disability rights organizations, civil rights lawyers, and journalists seeking comment. She watched as hashtags formed and multiplied. Justice for Elijah. Deaf Lives Matter. Disability rights. The video had struck a chord, exposing the intersection of racial bias, disability discrimination, and police brutality in one brutal moment. Community leaders began arriving at the hospital: pastors, local activists, and representatives from the deaf community. They gathered in the waiting room, planning their response, turning their shock and outrage into organized action. Maya found herself at the center of it all, translating between spoken English and sign language, becoming the bridge between different aspects of their community's pain. A disability rights lawyer named Sarah Chen arrived, her expression grim as she reviewed the incident report. "This is textbook discrimination," she signed to Elijah, her movements sharp with controlled anger. "The Americans with Disabilities Act requires law enforcement to provide appropriate accommodations. They failed at every level." The hospital's security team struggled to manage the growing crowd of supporters and media outside. Through the windows, Maya could see people holding candlelight vigils, their flames flickering like stars against the darkening sky. Signs in both English and ASL appeared. Protect disabled lives. Stop police brutality. This ends now. As night fell, Maya organized the first impromptu protest, right there in the hospital parking lot. She stood on a concrete planter, her voice raw with emotion, as she addressed the crowd. The gathering became a fusion of different communities. Black Lives Matter activists stood alongside disability advocates, united in their demand for justice. The local deaf community led chants in sign language, their silent movements more powerful than any shouted slogan. The community center buzzed with tension as Maya took the podium. The room was packed beyond capacity. Concerned citizens spilled into the hallways, and local news cameras lined the back wall. Maya's voice carried strength despite her exhaustion as she began sharing Elijah's story. Her words translated simultaneously into sign language by interpreters positioned throughout the room. "My brother was attacked," she stated plainly. "Not because he posed any threat, but because our police force lacks the basic training to recognize and respect disability. Elijah's only crime was walking while being black and disabled in his own neighborhood." The crowd sat in stunned silence as Maya detailed the events of that night, presenting body camera footage that had been released under pressure from community activists. The footage was devastating in its clarity. From the officer's perspective, viewers could see how quickly they jumped to conclusions, how they ignored clear signs of Elijah's disability, and how their aggressive approach created the very situation they claimed to fear. Several people in the audience had to look away when the video showed Elijah's face pressed against the pavement, his hands desperately trying to sign explanations that no one would understand. Officer Jenkins wasn't present at the meeting, but his superior, Captain Martinez, sat uncomfortably in the front row. As Maya spoke about the department's history of similar incidents, Martinez studied his hands, unable to meet the eyes of community members. The hashtag, Justice for Elijah, projected on the wall behind Maya, showed its reaching impact. Over 2 million mentions in just 3 days. Social media had transformed Elijah's story into a national conversation. Celebrities were sharing the video, disability rights organizations were issuing statements, and police departments across the country were being forced to confront their own practices. Maya played clips from national news coverage, showing how Elijah's case had become a catalyst for examining the intersection of race, disability, and law enforcement. During the question and answer session, a young police cadet stood up. "I'm in training now," she said, her voice shaking. "And we've had exactly 0 hours of instruction on interacting with deaf or disabled citizens. This could happen again tomorrow, and nothing in our current training would prevent it." Her admission sent ripples through the crowd and caused Captain Martinez to finally look up. His face, a mask of barely contained shame. The meeting reached its emotional peak when Maya played a video message from Elijah, recorded from his hospital room. Using sign language, with Maya's voice providing translation, he expressed not hatred, but a desire for change. "I don't want revenge," he signed. "I want understanding. I want training. I want the next deaf person or disabled person the police encounter to be seen as a human being first." Officer Jenkins, watching the live stream of the meeting from his home, felt the full weight of his actions. His social media accounts were flooded with messages, some threatening, others pleading for him to acknowledge his mistakes. As he watched Elijah's message, seeing the bruises his own hands had caused, something inside him began to crack. The therapist's office provided a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside. Officer Jenkins sat rigid in the plush chair, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes, as he faced his colleague, Officer Roberts, across the room. The department-mandated counseling session had turned into something more raw and honest than either man expected. "I keep seeing his face," Jenkins admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every night when I try to sleep, I see him trying to tell us something, and I see myself not listening." Roberts nodded, understanding all too well. The weight of their actions had been crushing them both, transforming their once confident demeanors into shells of uncertainty. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, guided their conversation toward the root causes of that night's events. Jenkins struggled to articulate the automatic assumptions that had driven his actions, the ingrained biases that had turned a simple patrol into a life-altering catastrophe. "We're trained to see threats," he explained, his voice cracking, "but nobody ever trained us to see people." As their session progressed, Roberts shared his own struggle with the aftermath. His children had seen the video at school, where it had become a topic of discussion in their social studies class. "My 13-year-old daughter asked me if I was one of the bad cops now," he said, tears finally breaking through his professional facade. "How do I explain to my kids what we did?" The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez suggested they meet with community leaders, not as officers, but as men willing to learn. Both Jenkins and Roberts initially resisted, fear and shame holding them back. But as they discussed the possibility, a glimmer of purpose emerged, a chance to transform their guilt into meaningful change. Their first meeting was arranged with deaf community leaders at a local advocacy center. Jenkins and Roberts arrived in civilian clothes, their vulnerability evident in every step. The room was tense as they faced people who had every reason to reject their presence. Through interpreters, they listened to stories of deaf individuals' previous encounters with law enforcement, each tale a mirror, reflecting their own ignorance. The most powerful moment came when a deaf rights advocate demonstrated how police procedures appeared from a deaf person's perspective. The simple act of reaching for identification became a dangerous movement when officers didn't understand what they were seeing. Standard commands became threats when they couldn't be heard. Safety protocols became weapons when applied without consideration for physical disabilities. As the session ended, Jenkins and Roberts found themselves in conversation with a veteran deaf rights activist who had been fighting for better police training for decades. "Your mistake," she signed, her interpreter's voice gentle but firm, "wasn't just in what you did that night. It was in all the days before when you never thought to learn about us." The truth of her words hit them both like physical blows. The city streets filled with a different kind of protest than usual. Instead of angry shouts, the air was thick with the silent power of thousands of hands moving in unified sign language. Elijah, now recovered enough to attend, sat in his wheelchair at the front of the march, a tablet computer mounted to his chair, serving as his voice to the world. The protest's organization reflected a new approach to civil resistance. Deaf participants led the way, teaching simple signs to hearing protesters. The result was a powerful visual statement, blocks of people moving their hands in unison, speaking without sound about justice and change. Signs reading, "Hear our silence," and "Sign of change," bobbed above the crowd. Elijah's tablet displayed messages that were projected onto large screens throughout the march route. "Disability is not a crime. Train the police. Save lives. Your fear of difference should not be my death sentence." Each message was met with waves of hands raised in silent applause, a sight that brought news cameras running and stopped traffic in its tracks. Meanwhile, inside the police academy, significant changes were taking shape. Jenkins and Roberts, having faced their own culpability, had become unlikely advocates for reform. They worked with disability rights experts to develop a comprehensive training program. Police cadets now spent mandatory hours learning basic sign language, understanding different types of disabilities, and practicing de-escalation techniques specific to encounters with disabled individuals. The training sessions were intense and often uncomfortable. Officers were made to experience simulations of various disabilities, wearing blindfolds, using wheelchairs, attempting to communicate without speaking. Many struggled, some grew frustrated, but all began to understand the vital importance of their education. Community involvement became central to the new training approach. Deaf individuals and people with various disabilities were invited to share their experiences directly with officers. These sessions broke down barriers as police learned to see beyond their preconceptions and recognize the humanity in those they served. The changes weren't limited to the police department. Local businesses began offering sign language classes, and the city council approved funding for enhanced disability awareness programs in schools. The movement that had begun with tragedy was transforming into a model for community-wide change. During one particularly moving training session, a veteran officer broke down in tears after attempting to navigate a simple traffic stop scenario while experiencing simulated cerebral palsy. "I never knew," he admitted to the group. "I never understood how much courage it takes just to walk down the street when the world isn't built for you." Elijah's presence at these sessions, when he felt strong enough to attend, had a profound impact. Officers who had only seen him through the viral video of his assault now saw his dignity, his intelligence, and his determination to create positive change from his trauma. His tablet became a bridge between worlds, translating not just words, but experiences. The City Hall chambers had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, the aisles packed with standing observers, as the public hearing on police reform began. Maya and Elijah sat at the witness table, their presence commanding attention even before they spoke. The hearing was being broadcast live, with simultaneous sign language interpretation and closed captioning. Maya's testimony cut through the usual political rhetoric with stark clarity. "We're not here to debate whether there's a problem," she began. "The evidence of that is sitting right next to me." She methodically presented statistics on police encounters with disabled individuals, each number representing a story like Elijah's that hadn't gone viral, hadn't sparked protests, hadn't led to change. When Elijah's turn came, the room fell into complete silence. Using his tablet and an interpreter, he shared his experience with deliberate precision. He described the terror of being unable to communicate while under attack, the helplessness of having his disability used against him, and the lasting trauma that made him flinch at every police siren. His words appeared on large screens around the chamber, ensuring no one could miss their impact. The council members shifted uncomfortably as body camera footage played again, this time annotated by disability experts who pointed out every missed opportunity for de-escalation, every ignored sign of Elijah's condition, every violation of established protocols. The police chief, watching from the front row, took notes with a trembling hand. But it was the parade of other witnesses that truly drove home the systemic nature of the problem. A deaf mother described being pepper sprayed when she couldn't hear commands during a routine traffic stop. A man with autism recounted being tackled for suspicious behavior while experiencing sensory overload. A wheelchair user testified about being forcibly removed from their chair by officers who saw it as a potential weapon. The hearing's tension peaked when the discussion turned to accountability. Despite the viral video, despite the public outrage, despite Elijah's injuries, no officers had faced criminal charges. The internal affairs investigation had stalled, caught in a web of union protections and departmental procedures designed to shield officers from consequences. Maya's voice shook with controlled anger as she addressed this point. "If I had done to an officer what they did to my brother, I would already be in prison. Why does the badge shield them from responsibility for their actions?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered but undeniable. The city council members exchanged glances, aware that the world was watching. The hearing had drawn national media attention, with civil rights leaders describing it as a potential turning point in how law enforcement handles interactions with disabled individuals. But for Elijah and Maya, sitting under the harsh lights of public scrutiny, justice still felt frustratingly out of reach. The police station plaza transformed into a sea of people, their signs and banners creating a colorful tapestry of protest against the gray concrete backdrop. Elijah, positioned at the front of the crowd, had become a powerful symbol of resilience. His tablet displayed messages that were echoed by thousands of voices and signing hands. No justice, no peace, in both English and ASL. The demonstration had drawn supporters from across the country. Disability rights activists from California stood alongside civil rights leaders from Georgia. Deaf community members from various states had traveled to show solidarity. Local families brought their children, turning the event into an impromptu lesson in civic engagement and social justice. The atmosphere was charged but peaceful until a group of counter-protesters arrived, carrying signs supporting the police and shouting about law and order. They positioned themselves across the street, their hostile energy creating an immediate tension. Police officers formed a line between the two groups, many of them visibly uncomfortable as they faced the consequences of their department's actions. The situation escalated when one of the counter-protesters crossed the police line, charging toward the main crowd while shouting slurs. Before officers could react, he shoved a young woman in a wheelchair, sending her spinning. The crowd surged forward in anger, the moment teetering on the edge of chaos. Then Elijah's message appeared on the giant screens mounted around the plaza. "We are here for peace. We are here for change. Don't let them turn our pain into their propaganda." The effect was immediate. The crowd stepped back, helping the woman in the wheelchair, their restraint more powerful than any violent response could have been. News cameras captured the moment, contrasting the dignity of the protesters with the aggression of their opponents. Elijah's calm leadership turned what could have been a disaster into a powerful demonstration of the change they sought. Even some of the officers on duty were seen nodding in approval at the peaceful resolution. The rest of the demonstration became a masterclass in peaceful resistance. When counter-protesters shouted, the crowd responded with silent, unified sign language. When provocateurs tried to start fights, they were met with seated meditation. Every attempt to spark violence was met with disciplined peace, led by Elijah's steady stream of messages calling for dignity and restraint. As the sun began to set, the crowd grew larger rather than dispersing. People brought food to share, set up impromptu teaching circles for sign language, and created spaces for storytelling about disability experiences. The protest had evolved into something more, a vision of the inclusive community they were fighting to build. The internal affairs investigation, initially sluggish, gained sudden momentum when national media outlets began publishing a series of exposés. Documents leaked from within the police department revealed a pattern of inadequate training and ignored complaints. Emails showed that concerns about officers' lack of disability awareness had been raised and dismissed multiple times before Elijah's incident. Maya became a regular presence on news programs, articulating the broader implications of her brother's case with passionate clarity. "This isn't just about one night or one incident," she explained during a primetime interview. "This is about a system that treats disability as a threat and difference as danger." Her words resonated across social media, with each interview gaining millions of views and shares. The investigation uncovered disturbing details about Officer Jenkins's and Officer Roberts' training history. Neither had received more than 30 minutes of disability awareness instruction in their entire careers. The department's training materials on dealing with deaf individuals were outdated by more than a decade, and there was no specific protocol for interacting with people with cerebral palsy or other motor disorders. Elijah's media appearances, though less frequent than Maya's, carried special weight. News outlets learned to accommodate his communication needs, providing extra time for him to type responses and ensuring sign language interpreters were present. His thoughtful, measured responses challenged stereotypes about disability and cognitive ability, making him an even more powerful advocate for change. Department emails revealed that several officers had requested additional training on disability interaction in the months before Elijah's assault, but these requests were denied due to budget constraints. The same budget, however, showed millions spent on military-grade equipment. This disparity became a rallying point for protesters demanding reallocation of police resources. As pressure mounted, cracks began appearing in the blue wall of silence. Junior officers came forward with their own stories of feeling unprepared for encounters with disabled individuals. A retired sergeant provided documentation of similar incidents that had been buried in internal reports. Each new revelation added weight to the demand for accountability. The media coverage expanded beyond Elijah's case to examine similar incidents nationwide. Journalists uncovered a disturbing pattern. Disabled individuals, particularly those of color, faced disproportionate rates of police violence. Statistics showed that up to half of all people killed by police had some form of disability. Yet this factor had been largely ignored in discussions of police reform. Maya and Elijah's advocacy extended beyond media appearances. They worked with legal experts to draft proposed legislation requiring comprehensive disability training for law enforcement. Their proposal, dubbed Elijah's Law, gained support from legislators in multiple states, promising to transform their personal tragedy into lasting systemic change. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation on the trial's opening day. The prosecution's table was laden with evidence boxes, surveillance footage, body camera recordings, training records, and expert testimony, all ready to tell the story of that fateful night. Maya sat in the front row, her hand firmly gripping Elijah's wheelchair as they prepared to face their moment of truth. Officers Jenkins and Roberts sat at the defense table, their once pristine uniforms replaced by civilian suits. The past months had visibly worn on them. Jenkins had lost weight, his face gaunt with stress, while Roberts's hair had gone noticeably gray. They avoided looking at Elijah, their eyes fixed on their hands or the table before them. The evidence presentation was methodical and devastating. Expert witnesses from the deaf community and disability rights organizations dismantled the officers' defense piece by piece. Medical professionals detailed how cerebral palsy affects movement, explaining how the officers had misinterpreted Elijah's natural gestures as aggression. Training experts testified about the glaring gaps in police education regarding disabilities. The turning point came when the prosecution played enhanced audio from Jenkins' body camera, revealing that another officer had actually whispered, "I think he's deaf," moments before the assault began. This crucial piece of ignored information sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Several jurors visibly recoiled, and one began to cry. The judge's decision was unequivocal. Both officers were found guilty of excessive force and violating Elijah's civil rights. The sentence included not just jail time, but a requirement that they participate in developing training programs for other departments after their release. Their case would become a mandatory case study in police academies nationwide. As the verdict was read, Elijah didn't celebrate. Instead, he typed out a message that was displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. "This moment isn't about punishment, it's about change. Let this be the last time someone like me has to fear those sworn to protect us." The trial's conclusion coincided with the announcement that Elijah would receive the National Civil Rights Award for his advocacy work. The ceremony, held in Washington, D.C., brought together activists, lawmakers, and law enforcement leaders committed to reform. Elijah's acceptance speech, delivered through his tablet and interpreter, received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Maya and Elijah's story became more than a viral video or a courtroom drama. It became a catalyst for national change. Police departments across the country began implementing mandatory disability awareness training. Laws were passed requiring officers to learn basic sign language and disability recognition. The incident that nearly cost Elijah his life had sparked a revolution in how law enforcement interacts with the disabled community. The final image that dominated news coverage wasn't of protest or pain, but of Elijah, surrounded by a graduating class of police cadets who had completed the new disability awareness program he helped design. His journey from victim to victor, from subject of violence to agent of change, had transformed not just policies and procedures, but hearts and minds.